Thank you very much. Just in terms of how we're going to look at it, firstly, I want to do a very quick introduction to what we understand by Art Deco, and then also just to understand the context, particularly the Cape Town context, of where does Art Deco come in, how did it come about, and go through that, and then identifying also, I think what's, as we go along, what looks at characteristics, but I'd also like very much to identify the profile of the sort of architects that did Art Deco. So in the first, if we look at, and this is Marilyn Martin, who many of you might know, was the director of the National Gallery here in Cape Town. And her definition of what Art Deco is that I think it goes to the heart of it, that it's eclectic. In other words, it draws from many sources, and historicist. So it's conservative. It's not radical like the modern movement, which one thinks of in terms of the Bauhaus, architects like Le Corbusier in France. So underlying it is an axial symmetry, drawing on in essentially Beaux-Arts elements. And so it differs very much from the characteristics that we identify with the modern movement. What I think is extraordinary about Art Deco is that, unlike the modern movement, where there were protagonists, people wrote about it, there were many manifestos relating to a whole series of those early 20th century movements, Art Deco simply emerges. It's a popular movement. And although the idea of what constitutes Art Deco was not something which happened at the time, in other words, in the early 20th century, it emerged really in the 1960s. There is no manifesto, but what is extraordinary is the way that there is an architecture and design, in fact, broad-based design, which one found all over the world, which drew on this particular and developed this particular design vocabulary, so that one actually can recognize today what constitutes Art Deco. But so what I'd like to just identify first of all is, so because this is very much around Cape Town. So what happened as we started? What was Cape Town like? So this was the Cape Town that existed right through until the end of the 1930s, when Cape Town, essentially at that point, the foreshore scheme means that Cape Town moves over into a modernist paradigm. The foreshore is modernist, it is not Art Deco. And so this image is the image of Cape Town, which persists until the end of Art Deco. And we see that the way that Cape Town presented itself outwardly, that there are several manifestations of Art Deco. But what I'd also like to point, when we're going to be looking at, is the way that that form emerged in the early 20th century, because we tend to think about what came before, and sometimes one goes from the idea of Victorian architecture, and then people often think that there's this Art Nouveau architecture, which we don't really have in South Africa, not in Cape Town, and that Art Deco suddenly emerges, which it didn't quite do. So late 1930s Cape Town. This is the image then from seeing the foreshore. This is perhaps at the end of that period, the 1930s. The old Mutual constructed, opened in 1941, started during the Second World War. And really, this is the end of that Art Deco period. And so we see Cape Town still very much the city as it had grown organically, developed, and not something which had been pre-planned. So what was the transition in Cape Town to Art Deco? Well, because it didn't move directly from the earlier 20th century Edwardian architecture, it didn't also, so we didn't have an Art Nouveau architecture, and there is a transition that happens. And the transition is a Mediterranean architecture which emerged. So in the image you see in there, you can see Newspaper House, the first stage of it, of course, as it exists today, it's double that size, which was done by an architect called W.H. Grant. And you can see there the elements. If you look at the roof detailing, very much drawing on a Mediterranean, Renaissance, classical idiom of architecture. And on the right is New Zealand Chambers, which also done by Douglas Hoots, which also draws on this architectural language which one found. The houses in the 1930s, just again so that one understands difference, is that if I were to speak to you in Johannesburg, and a Johannesburg Art Deco, what we certainly would be focusing on would be the kind of houses which were built in Houghton for an emerging moneyed class, which was very much in the Art Deco idiom. In Cape Town, as you can see, houses by Grant there for the Garlicks, very much still continuing in this Art Deco, in the sort of arts and crafts tradition. Fred Glennie, these are architects who actually practiced later on doing arts and crafts architecture, but you can see their domestic work. And also Magda Sauer, also a prominent architect, continuing there in the Herbert Baker arts and crafts tradition with Cape Dutch gables, and also the house in the lower left, also with a thatched roof. So even in the late 20s, one sees also there a building which was much admired. Interestingly, in Johannesburg, it was admired in the architectural press there, done by James Morris, who was a prominent Cape Town architect, what was then the Reserve Bank, done, and of course, in a full-blown Italian Renaissance style based on an Italian palazzo, a very finely detailed building. But this does mark a transition from both Baker's approach to the architecture, his Edwardian architecture. This is much more purist in terms of the way it uses classical architecture. But it also identifies the point in the late 1920s of where Cape Town was in terms of prominent public buildings. In the sense that the Reserve Bank is a public building. This is a building done, of course, in the late 30s and by Grant. This is a building which Grant started in the 1920s. It's in Greenmarket Square, in on the square as you might know today. The right-hand side was the original building as it first started, and it grew southwards. So the building was then extended to the south, just to the left-hand side of the slide. And then, of course, the Art Deco image, of course, was that's part of this identification of logos. So it's of course was then became Shell House. So it's at Shell House. The clock tower at the top is based on the clock tower of Shell House in London. So what's this key moment that we talk about when we say this? Why do we talk about Art Deco? And I think the critical point it is this moment, the art exposition in Paris, 1925. It is not the start of what's Art Deco. If we talk about, is this the start of Art Deco? No, it's a seminal moment. There were influences that happened before then. Of course, the First World War, 1914, 1918, caused a hiatus in terms of awareness of what was happening. But we do have to recognize that in Austria, we have the Austrian secession, people like Joseph Hoffmann, Otto Wagner. In Scotland, we have Mackintosh, architects who actually started introducing elements which became part of the language of Art Deco. So this exhibition, though, 1925, first exhibition since prior to the First World War, is this point at which a new form of decoration come along. What I think is also critical about this was, and one has to understand that it's the first since the end of the First World War. At the end of the First World War, there was also a great need, people felt, for change. So although modernism, in terms of modern architecture and modern movement, which is a schism that breaks from the past, that there was an awareness and a need for a new architectural and a new design language. And so this exhibition marks then the point, not so much of the modern movement, although Le Corbusier was present there, what it is a form of mediated modernism. In other words, it introduces modernism, but it retains links from the past. Now, what you'll see I quote through here is there were two in South Africa. We have two publications which, in terms of talking about architecture, there's the South African Architectural Record in Johannesburg, which is based in Johannesburg, and in Cape Town we have the Architect, Builder, and Engineer. The Architect, Builder, and Engineer was very much a reactionary local magazine, and so their reaction to the 1925 exhibition, as you can see there, August 1925, where they talk about, they're horrified by it, height of absurdity. They talk about their description that you read there about the Czechoslovakian pavilion, which they say defies description, that is like a worm having a fit. I have to tell you, it's actually the pavilion on the right. So this is the sort of reaction to it. You must understand that that if one again contrasts, as I touched on earlier, between Johannesburg and Cape Town, is that Johannesburg, in terms of modernism, had a school of architecture at Wits University which promoted modernism. So there was a school in order where this new form of architecture could develop, and they were champions of it. In Cape Town, we didn't have that. The School of Architecture, which existed in the early 1920s, was run by the Cape Institute of Architects. It was run by practitioners and was, as a result, very, very, very conservative. So their idea of what architecture should be in the 1920s was simply a continuation of that which had happened before. So that's why you'll see some of these comments that you see there. The other one I wanted to just show as well from the Paris exhibition was the Ruhlmann Pavilion of a Collector. Ruhlmann, of course, was an important French designer in terms of the fact that he designed furniture, very, very expensive furniture. It was what they called an ébéniste. It promoted the idea of Art Deco design being not, and because it was designed for a very wealthy clientele, it actually gave it the right sort of cachet that it filtered down to much more ordinary people and to mass production. So what I want to look at here, which just is what are the characteristics of Art Deco architecture, which we see here. One is the fact that it's symmetrical, the use of the semicircular bay that you see at the bay window, the stepping ziggurat form that the building has, and then on that curved bay window, you see bas-reliefs. Now, those are all elements which one finds in Art Deco architecture. You'll also see on the sides the idea of the columns, but they're stripped. They aren't classical columns. So there is classicism there, but the classicism is stripped. There aren't any of the normal characteristics which we would expect in classical architecture. So this sets then part of this framework for what would constitute Art Deco. From this exhibition, the place where it went to next was to America. And that's where it really developed a great deal more. So when we come to Cape Town then, the influences are, yes, people looking back to this exhibition, but also looking very much to what was happening in America and what American architects talking about. So in Cape Town, where we find it coming in, it emerges particularly in what I would call new building forms. So the first one I'm going to identify is entertainment buildings, the cinema, the so-called bioscope, for those of you of a certain age who might remember that. And so these presented a whole new kind of architecture, and the possibilities then of developing a new architecture. So this is the Plaza Cinema in Cape Town. The building is still incidentally there. It's been extended upwards. Of course, it doesn't have a cinema anymore. But so here's one of the first. So from the outside, when you look at it and think, well, this is very much still that kind of, the elements here of a kind of classical language. It has a plinth, it has a central section which has certainly very much directed bays, but then it has the sort of curving, recognizes the corner very much, and then the sort of sense of movement at the top. Kallenbach and Kennedy, of course, were a Johannesburg firm of architects. But it's when you looked at the inside and the foyer of it that we see here the application of certainly very much Art Deco elements. Same as you might find anywhere, both in America, in London. This is like the Savoy Theatre. This idea of stepped forms. It had a gilded ceiling there, that stepped ceiling, the decorative patterning on the walls of the foyer, and then of course the Art Deco carpeting, decoration on the columns. So all of these, you can, what immediately comes to mind are the two elements that one sees here again, which characterize Art Deco architecture: the sense of movement, so this sweeping form. So we'll often identify this idea of movement, which emerges, of course, from things like Italian futurism. The idea of decoration, Paris exhibition. There were, of course, because one was now developing a new design vocabulary, you could draw on all sorts of things and what was happening there in the 1920s. So one has to look at things like the archaeological developments, of course, the discoveries in Egypt, the Tutankhamun discovery of his tomb, which presented a whole new design vocabulary. From pre-war, there'd of course been the Ballet Russe, which gave vivid colors, and which never really had a chance to be explored design-wise because the First World War came along. And then, of course, again, archaeological discoveries in America, Aztec, Inca ruins, which again presented a new design vocabulary. So that architects then, looking at some kind of continuity with the past, were able to develop this sort of mediated modernism, where they could build on a new architecture based on what was emerging, this idea of the modern movement, however, not ignoring ornament, which of course the modern movement, people like Walter Benjamin said, ornament is a crime. But here the idea that you can put ornament in if it's a new form of ornament. And so this development of a new kind of architectural language. And so we find that in the development of cinemas around Cape Town, unfortunately, essentially they've all disappeared in Cape Town. The era of those cinemas has gone by, as they have essentially worldwide. Places like Britain, where they have bingo halls, of course, they managed to survive perhaps as bingo halls, but here very much they're disappearing. Note, as we've seen architects like W.H. Grant, and I'll speak about Grant. He was an architect who was particularly involved in the development of Art Deco architecture, and certainly in the development of cinemas. This one also, again by Grant, this was in Rosebank, just below the university, and which survived in a fragment until about a year or so ago, just over a year ago. The right-hand side survived. So here we see these streamlined semicircular forms, the idea of vertical ribs which go over the cinema, the idea of the way it sets back into a forecourt. So it's using symmetric, using a kind of classical architectural language, but with streamlined forms. So this whole idea of streamlining is one of the important characteristics of Art Deco architecture. The idea that you can also see there are flagpoles, which seem to have been extremely popular. Never seen them with flags on, but the idea always was that you could be able to have flags. Sea Point had the Adelphi. So you see there the kinema, as they called it in those days. And then, of course, again, widespread throughout Cape Town. From those buildings, so we can see that in art, so we see it in entertainment buildings. The next cluster that I'd like us to identify is commercial buildings. And the first one is quite a strange one, which is the Santam building, which is on the corner of Whale and Berg Street. It was the headquarters of Santam Insurance. And what's interesting about that is that it's the emergence of the Afrikaner into the commercial world. Prior to this, they're always seen as essentially a farming community. But here we find with the rise of Afrikaner nationalism, the movement into an engagement with the city and becoming part of it. And what's interesting about this as the first building like this in Cape Town is the fact that the language it adopted is Art Deco. That rather than a modernist architecture, it deliberately seemed to have chosen this particular language. Now, Low and Low, the architects who were Paarl-based, Willem Low practiced right from the beginning of the 20th century, and did many buildings in Paarl, of course, often drawing on a Cape Dutch tradition. But here he goes to this American Art Deco tradition. And my own view of this is that he was avoiding anything to do which was vaguely British. So definitely not a classical architecture such as Herbert Baker would have done. And the idea, I think this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, I have to say this, is that the Art Deco, the sort of vertical Art Deco that he was applying here, very much American. And of course, we know that the Americans won the War of Independence, so they would set a good precedent as a language. The other thing, of course, noticing, and you'll see it in many of these buildings, is the way that there's this emphasis on verticality. Of course, as you can see by the number of stories, our buildings weren't particularly high by comparison to those in Manhattan. But one desperately made the building seem as tall as possible. There it is as it was extended. The bas-reliefs that you can see there on the building, particularly on Berg Street, and at the top of the building, they do, of course, relate to farming activities and the emergence then of the Afrikaner in industry. So particularly the blue and white plaque, so almost like De La Robbia wear on the top, very much relating to the tradition, Afrikaans tradition then of the farmer, but also then showing him engaging, and that therefore engaging in the sort of the commercial world, which I think was seen as being very important in terms of the imagery it presented. And just so that one also understands that if you think that it was this sort of movement, something that happened broadly, this is a year later, this is Herbert Baker's Barclays, what was the Barclays Bank building in Adderley Street, of course, still there for those of you who know it. And it simply draws, Baker rejected modernism completely. It's in the same language that Baker had used in the Union buildings, 1912. He continues the same language for people like Baker and for a number of older architects. This was this idea of a modern architecture, both in terms of the modern movement and Art Deco, was seen as something which was something to be rejected, and that you simply should continue as you'd continued before. Baker, of course, had done this. He was, this was after he'd been working in New Delhi in India. So, of course, this is, as he saw it, something which eventually the world would see what their error of their ways, and and go back to this sort of architecture. But the place where we see quite a lot of it would be the Macquarie House, Green Market Square. So here we see on the corner of Berg Street in Green Market Square, Robertson Small, a Cape Town-based architect. Doug Roberts, locally trained. This is the Macquarie House. So it draws on elements which are both classical, but if one looks at the details, so the lower right, you can see the elements of those projecting balconies, and those details are not classical. They are Art Deco. So there's this language which combines these two, so that they're drawing both, so that the overall language still has an Edwardian classical underlying language, but the detail, the vocabulary, is Art Deco. Now, what I said at the beginning was, what sort of architect was that? And here we see W.H. Grant. And this is Federico Freschi talking about form followed facade. And he points out that what these really were was the sort of architecture which one saw was that the sort of buildings were, was in terms of scale, they tried to emphasize the scale. W.H. Grant was a Scottish-born architect coming to Cape Town just before the end of the 19th century and working in Cape Town. So as I showed at the beginning, there was an image of the Musenberg Pavilion. His architecture changes. So the early work that he does in the beginning of the 20th century was a kind of watered down arts and crafts. He continues in, as I showed you, in the transitional work that became before Art Deco. Those buildings that I showed, like Newspaper House, was done by him. His transition was the sort of Mediterranean neoclassical architecture. He did it both in the city centre. He did, and those of you who might know the house in St. James, which he did for the Garlics, which was originally called Watergate, also in that same sort of language. So when he comes in the sort of period, late 1920s, he adopts Art Deco. And I think that what for older trained architects, this made sense because the idea of throwing everything out to try and adopt modernism was something which they just couldn't understand. Whereas they understood the idea of a modern form, but applying a new decorative vocabulary. And so he's someone I'll show a great deal of in Cape Town. So this is Commercial Union, which he did, Green Market Square. Commercial Union, again, the sort of buildings we see that where Art Deco emerges strongly in Cape Town are particularly insurance buildings. And so this is done by him. It's done with reconstituted stone. In terms of focusing, it has an emphasis on verticality. The decoration that you see there draws on not only the elements which I spoke about earlier, like Aztec, Inca, but also one art movement which was also important was Cubism. So a lot of these the idea of these splintered, shattered forms comes out of Cubism. Also, of course, things like the Dutch de Stijl, which introduced the sort of fragmented geometric forms. The idea here, of course, of adding decoration high up on the building and then focusing very much on the vertical creates a sense of height, and it makes you look up. And because you're looking up, it gives you a sense of it being rather taller than it was. So there you see the original drawings. And as you might see, if you can see the drawing, the note there, it says adds additional story added. So they were desperately trying to increase the height of the building. And here again, what's interesting is that the earlier comment about in 1925, the architect, builder, and engineer was sort of so scathing about it. And here you can see this is the image of this where they talk, say, modernism and modernism note in design almost in excelsis had come to Cape Town. This is the new school is the headquarters of the Commercial Union Insurance Company. This point, I just want to point out this idea of why one sees it in insurance companies was one interesting idea is that, and I found it when I looked at American architecture, was that banks tended to be, even in the 1930s, frequently, very often, quite like Baker, quite conservative. And I think it was the essence of banking, particularly in the Depression, when where it was a major, the whole economic collapse, that the bank should present a conservative image. However, insurance is to do with the future. We don't insure the past or the present. We insure a future, an uncertain future. So the language that it adopted was this modern, futuristic form. So that's one of the reasons why I believe that insurance buildings happily adopted Art Deco. So here's some details of it. Note, people who worked for the architect Grant said he just used to use magazines and point out details and say use this one or that one. Ziggurat forms we've seen, zigzags, another form that one finds here. On the left-hand side, you can see, notice the protea on the walkway. The American eagle comes from a magazine. And so these elements continue in a number of buildings. Again, we see these buildings. This is an architect called Chapman. Again, this idea of focusing on verticality. This is a later building, 1936, the Coliseum Building. Here, Grant, the forms are very, very much abstracted geometric forms. But again, you see elements at just above eye level height as you walk along, so your eye does pick up, identify the building, but then there's nothing in between. Your eye looks up and focuses on the top of the building. There were, of course, and I think that's why I point out that between this, there's also this kind of a stripped classical deco. The old General Post Office in Darling Street was an example of this, erected towards the end of the 1930s. So you can see that the classical architecture used here is not strict classical. It's been very much abstracted and reduced. So we just see the suggestion of pilasters, suggestion of capitals. So this was another kind of architectural language, particularly popular with government buildings. The other form of building which Grant did was a new form, which was when the cheaper bazaars came along in the 1930s, again addressing the issues of the Depression. Okay, bazaars, therefore, not wanting to be like Stutterfords or Garlicks. So it adopted this Art Deco architecture done by Grant. Again, if you notice on the right, this focus on the vertical, those geometric forms, the panels in between, quite decorative at the top. They're Grant drawing very much on Aztec elements in the top, very top decorative panels. You can see it there. You can see those, the very top. Again, making you look up to create this sense of significance. And these were buildings then which really emerge during this period. Hardware house, smaller scale, still drawing on classical architecture, commercial banking, another insurance building on the right. A rare example of a shop front, Muller's Optometrist, done in black vitrolite glass, as it was called, with these wonderful leaded light windows at upper level. Certainly worth a visit, since both the fittings inside, it's completely intact. So this is a very, very rare example of what used to be all over Cape Town. As shops adapted in the 1930s, this was very popular. So there, not only there's the logo, which even identifies what they did, with the spectacles on the left. And then, of course, it also went into other buildings. So we had public buildings. But again, the architect, builder, and engineer was horrified by the new fire station in Roland Street. So this was, you can see the comment that they made. They thought it was aggressive and brutally ugly. They thought it was illogical. the irony about the illogicality is that it's still in current use today, unlike many others. There's one example of a bank building in Cape Town, which was Barclays Bank at Salt River Circle, which I'm delighted to see is still there today. For a long time, it was covered over with metal cladding, but it's again visible on the outside, done by grant, and this is very rare to find a bank building done in Art Deco. There was a building which I took a little while back, just before it was the final stripping, in a very prominent position. But there, Grant using this, and one clearly sees this kind of link, this crossover in the sort of the form of of this architectural language. Art Deco shop fronts. They could be done with a simple building behind, looking modern to the street. Sunbursts, very popular. Stepped facades, like this one in Long Street. Industrial buildings. This was the former Pepsi Cola building. Part of it still survives. UCT there, not much of it. A little bit still survives. The new radio station in Milnerton, Marconi Beam. Marconi Beam, of course, named because this is where it was, and it's still there. The building's still there, much changed, but it's still there. Also by Grant.
There's the lecture.
Yes.
How did we get
it? This is, so then the next is the other buildings. There aren't many, again, some synagogues. This is the wonderful Frederhoek Synagogue by Ingber. The Sea Point Synagogue by Julius Lonstein. This has been changed much more. I think one of the reasons that one finds it, particularly with synagogues, an interesting comment I've had in terms of when I was doing research on modernism, was there's a very strong Zionist link to modernism, which was that one should never look to the past, that the important element of Zionism was always to build a new future. So one finds, for example, in Israel, they did not go and in terms of the development of Israel, even the 1920s, it was very much around architecture which came out the Bauhaus and a lot of Art Deco buildings, because it was looked to a modern future. One strange outlier, which I found quite extraordinary, which is the Dutch Reformed Church in Belleville, one of the few examples of a Dutch Reformed church which also uses this Art Deco language in a strange combination, so that it sort of reinterprets Gothic at that entrance there as a sort of stepped Art Deco way. The other one, of course, is movement. So streamlining, of course, in motor cars. And I pointed out we've seen some buildings. Of course, the ideal thing, therefore, for things like garages, motor showrooms. This was in Salt River. It's still there in part. This building was Holmes Motors. So the idea there of reflecting this idea of the new motor car, the idea of filling stations and showrooms, which was a whole new sort of architecture. The idea that also, this of course is in Paarl, but also, and it's still there, by the way, it has its canopy still in place. The building's still in place, but the canopy now hides it. And then this whole idea of motor cars really caught the imagination. Although you had to be quite wealthy at this particular time, following the stock market collapse, to actually own motor cars. But the interesting thing here is also this idea that South African women choosing colors for the cars. This building's still holding out in the center of Cape Town. It was threatened for a long time. Faber Motors, as it was, built in 1935, corner of Dock Road and Bree Street, where the building, it addresses the corner. It expresses entrances, the ground floor. So again, a transition there, very much perhaps in the modernist, but still drawing very much on Art Deco. Particularly look at that corner, that bay window, that center bay, like the Ruhlmann Bay in Paris. So then we look at residential buildings. Now, Cape Town, unlike Johannesburg, in terms of individual houses, very, very few. So one finds a house like this, which was built in Oranjezicht at the time. The outside reads very much like an Art Deco building. It has corner windows, flat roofs, white walls, projecting canopies on the roof. However, if you look at the image on the right, that's the interior. That's the lounge, as they called it there, of the house, which you can see is very, very conservative. So in Cape Town, we don't have the same sort of approach to the idea of accepting modernist design as wholeheartedly as it had been in Johannesburg. In Cape Town, there is this underlying conservatism. So we don't see it in very few individual houses. There's another example. Again, they tend to be much changed. They're leaked. So what happened both here and in Johannesburg, people put pitch roofs on. They tended to add more windows. They enclosed balconies. So they often tend to look very different today. But the building which really had a significant impact in terms of modernism and Art Deco in Cape Town was the so-called flat building, apartment buildings. They called it the flat building craze. A lot of people, particularly both in religious people and in terms of certain civic movements, where they hoped this was a passing craze, that they thought people did not like this sort of building. This also Robertson Small, its very prominent position in Claremont, but addressed what was happening in the city at the time. There were more and more people moving from rural areas into the city, both in terms of the suburbs and into the center city. So this then gives rise to not high rise, but essentially a low rise. So there are this is the southern suburbs, the building from the outside, Herschel Court, expressing things like windows, the idea there of a sense of movement, played down, but there is this sense of horizontal movement that addresses the corner. Sea Point, of course, redeveloped considerably at the time. Also, Robertson Small, very prominent. This is Dorchester Apartments. There you can see the open balconies, unfortunately, many of them enclosed nowadays. Steel windows, horizontally glazed. A famous one in the center of town, Holyrood Apartments in Queen Victoria Street, done in 1939. Really a series of bachelor apartments with an almost unusable little balcony with this little, I'll call it the little Greta Garbo projection, which is this tiny little projection that comes forward in the L, as you might see on the right-hand side of the slide, on the plan. It's really all to do with creating a vertical expression. There, the building as it was really in the 1930s, you can see it emerged with low-rise residential buildings essentially around it. This is from the gardens. And here you can see this, the way it played with verticality. So it expresses and delights in the idea of reading as an extremely strong vertical movement. So it has this fin that wraps up over the top of the building, has these curving facades, and as I say, with that short projection, which really doesn't really serve much practical purpose, but a really powerful expression of these apartment buildings. Extensive development in Sea Point, and here's where we of course see change coming in. Kenilworth, even in places like Camps Bay, this was Brighton Court, stepped form here. And if you look at that entrance, you'll see that the way that stepped entrance really reflecting on the right-hand side, the Glasgow School of Art by Mackintosh. So there is this reference back to an earlier design vocabulary. This is Kloofneck Road, just giving you an idea of this broad range. Then there's a suburb, which just going to quickly go through them, just showing you this is Vredehok, which really, all of these buildings creates this impression of a suburb with these fairly low-rise Art Deco buildings, but creating a streetscape. These are pavilion buildings. They do not block the street. These are a series of Art Deco pavilions, like the Paris exhibition. sweeped curved forms, streets with this consistent form of building, balconies, symmetry. And this is an architecture which sadly is greatly threatened because there's a demand here for development. So the glazing gets changed, balconies get enclosed, which takes the architectural language away. And this is the great threat. People also, the idea then of enlarging, which of course removes part of this character. It's a simple architecture. It's not an elaborate building. But this part, Vredehok, is the one part of Cape Town where there was this possibility, or has been this possibility, of creating an Art Deco area. Finally, just to show you what I think is the jewel of Art Deco in Cape Town, which is the old Mutual building, designed by the architects Fred Glennie and Low, who I pointed out earlier. Fred Glennie, of course, trained with Herbert Baker, was also one of those architects, also comes from an older tradition as an arts and crafts architect, but in the 1930s then adopts modernism. He looked at this after this building emerges after he had in fact been to America and looked at American Art Deco architecture and high-rise buildings. So again, this emphasis on verticality. But where I started when I looked and I showed you the Rollman exhibition, a pavilion in Paris, here you see that same idea of the stepped forms, where at this point in time that what I think Glennie and Low have done, which is the shift that we find in this from the early 1930s, is that the decoration here relates to architecture of South Africa. It is not no longer simply. So we find the building, first of all, that the elements on the corner, these both you can see the decorative points there, the elephant, the gorilla. But here, very much in this image, you can see this focus on verticality. This building had also very, very high quality finishes. That the windows, for example, which are still there, of course, are done in bronze. They're not steel. So no expense spared in terms of granite on the facades. These decorative elements, both the elephants and the baboons on the front facade, these bas-relief, which is very much a non-PC history, is by Ivan Mitford Barberton. On the side elevation, there his 9 tribes of Africa. So instead of drawing there on another tradition, again, you'd seen it in America. In America, there are high-rise buildings which also draw on American Indian design elements. So here you see the bas-relief. The entrance of Darling Street, which has, as you enter, of course, it has to take you up the stairs. So it uses all sorts of devices to lead you up, essentially an entire flight, which is very difficult normally. It's not one of those things which people easily do. But the light fittings, the way they step up, the vertical chrome strips which go up to the ceiling. The ceiling was gold leafed and imported marble walls, leading then into the banking hall at the top. The glazing of the banking hall is what one would call an idicular. In other words, it draws on the stepped form, as you can see in the frosted glass, is the form of the building. Pink marble, black granite. This was designed to be an extremely impressive space to be in. Throughout, there's this relationship to the drawing on the lower right is in fact Fred Glennie's drawing, but the link then between the appearance of the building from the outside, the way it uses classical elements, but creates this incredible space inside. This went through to all sorts of internal spaces. This is the boardroom, painted paneling by Joyce Ord Brown, wonderful light fittings. Again, aluminium around the entrance doors. This is the assembly room, members' assembly room, with murals, wonderful, again, fantastic light fittings. Murals by LaRue Smith LaRue. Which essentially also, relate to Mexican decorative mural painting. So it also, and it uses, but also the sort of this kind of language which one found. It also, so in this particular image, we see the city behind it. We see Old Mutual Building there. We see this idea of the modern city, because you can see the Union Castle ship there. We also see South Africa's colonial, very much a reflection of the colonialist history by the roles that people are playing, who does what. So it also, one has to understand that it reflects also part of that colonial past. It isn't simply a decorative panel which has no inherent meaning. And here from the side, as one looks down onto that, you can also see something which I think is quite extraordinary in this particular building, which is the kind of detailing that the different elements have. And so here you also see the balcony details, which are essentially still classical, but which are they're very, very refined, but drawing really on the most refined Art Deco language. So at the end of the 1930s, with the erection of that building, which was completed really in 1941 when it was occupied, in the late 1930s, we see the end of this era. What is it? What sort of things marked it? The destruction. I started by saying that we saw the end of the pier, that was sort of characterized Cape Town, although it emerged much earlier than the Edwardian pier. But the destruction to create the reclamation of the foreshore really marks the end of this Art Deco city. And the victory of modernism, because with the reclamation came a new foreshore, a new foreshore plan, which then developed a new architectural language, which was modern. And so the city, which had grown and changed from what it had been at the emergence of the First World, at the end of the First World War, which was essentially still an Edwardian city, the city which we saw at the end of this period had undergone this transition, so that at the end of at this point, this city is now overshadowed by this new city, which is a modernist city. And so the Art Deco that we find left in the city is an Art Deco which really relates to this earlier period. I think it's an important period in terms of the city's history, and it's one which I believe is critical that we both understand, appreciate, and preserve, not simply willy-nilly and everywhere, but it is an important stage in the development of the city, and some of the finest Art Deco in Cape Town stands up to any scrutiny anywhere in the world. So that Frederhoek, which people have often said isn't because of the nature of the way the buildings sit apart from each other, I have to point out that anybody who's been to Miami and looked at the Art Deco district there would see that other than the colors which we have, that there's a great deal of similarity in terms of scale, size of buildings, other than the major buildings which are on the main roads, there are lots in Miami of that same sort of Art Deco buildings which now attract people to go to Miami. So my plea at the end of this talk is to say, to try and look to understand and to appreciate Art Deco. Thank you.
Please, everybody unmute your mic and give Andre a hand of applause. Andre, we're about to be cut off in a couple but you've really opened our eyes to our city in just an absolutely wonderful way. I'm going to see somebody says so wonderful, thank you. If there are any questions, we have a couple of minutes before we're all going to be cut off unceremoniously. You can either raise your hand or type a question in or a comment in the chat bar. Okay. Thank you. People are thanking you, telling you you're wonderful.
Thank you. Good audience.
There's a good audience. Just absolutely fascinating photographs. Did you collect all of those in your PhD research, or it's obviously an ongoing thing for you, going around
yes,
the city?
Some of them I did. Some of them I collected at that time. Of course, some of the older black and white ones, because I was, as part of what I was doing was to look and find, to understand, because as you saw, my PhD was this idea of negotiating modernism. So I was trying to understand. People sort of said no modernist stuff in Cape Town until after the war. And I was seeing that it was this sort of Art Deco architecture as part of this movement. So some of it is ones that I took myself, as there's some of them certainly ones that I've certainly found at the time.
Someone says here in the chat, can we read your PhD or anything else you've written? Have you? I mean, I'm sure your PhD is available on UCT's.
Yes, it's available. It's called Negotiating Modernism in Cape Town. Negotiating
Modernism in Cape Town will be available.
Yeah, it says Negotiating Modernism in Cape Town, 1918-1948. But if you type my name in and say UCT thesis, it comes there.
And have you done other more popular bits of writing that people can?
Yes, I have. No, they tend to be on sort of academic publications. Okay. I can certainly, post it afterwards. I mean, the summer school does have a there's a web page afterwards, isn't it, that people can add comments?
Yeah, I can add any more material to the easy access summer school web page for your course.
Yeah,
so perhaps we'll do that between us.
Yeah, I'll do that. We'll do that.
Lovely. Another comment, lovely to see Cape Town buildings through new eyes. Thank you, Andre. Excellent lecture. So interesting. Thank you. So